free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, as always on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Well, tonight we're starting a new show within the Coalition Radio Network. A very brief history. The Coalition Radio started out in somewhere around 2013 as a once-weekly, one-hour interview show. Conversation-based, long-form conversation-based. Over the years, it evolved into a 3-hour video presentation from our days in AM radio. And then, of course, in the months leading up to the pandemic, we decided to take it in even a bigger direction. We've got 5 nights now of original programming under the guise of the Coalition Radio Network. And I realized that in all the work we've done, partnering with a number of folks, the best legal show in Rhode Island, Chaz Kalenda, attorney at law, a golf show, the Golf Dudes, RAMP, Real Access Motivates Progress, and a handful of projects that we've got ongoing, working with everyone from the sort of community help necessary for people recovering from the pandemic, a brilliant new math show by Rich Southwell, which focuses on math tutoring, as well as a couple of political talk shows aimed at the national libertarian market. I realized I'd gotten away from the one thing I loved, which is challenging issues, speaking to subject matter experts from a variety of organizations who we partnered with over the years, or some organizations that are new to us for whom we have tremendous respect, not only for their global reach, but also, quite honestly, for the issues that they challenge. And that's how, of course, we came up with the Washington Outsider Project, which is done with Irina Zuckerman. That'll be on later on this evening. An issue fundamental to the coalition since its very, very beginning, I loosely refer to as border justice. Folks who know me personally know that I'm a libertarian, and let's just say I diverge from a number of political beliefs in my support of what I'll largely refer to as open borders. Yes, there I said it, open borders. It's interesting, sometimes people come to me in an accusatory tone, you believe in open borders. I'm like, yeah, hello. Anyone who knows me knows that I firmly believe that borders are a function, if you will, of an authoritarian society generated in some cases hundreds of years ago that have no respect for either culture, tradition, history, people, and are used as arbitrary forces to control economies. I personally believe in the free exchange of people, idea, and commerce. Excuse me, and I'm willing to put it to work. I personally, in terms of interaction with the border, go back a few years ago to what we referred to at the time as the Deming Project. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But there are a handful of organizations, as I mentioned, that I have profound respect for. And one of them is Human Rights Watch. If you've noticed lately, we've started taking some of the material that they're nice enough to send us and allow us to sort of package it for our website for your reading and educational purposes on some of the most challenging regions of the world. Human Rights Watch is not where you're going to find nice, happy, pat endings with stories that talk about the global good of, well, anybody, and they're going to focus intensely on regions where you have, well, I could say the abridgments of human rights, but in most cases, it's the thorough destruction of human rights. In communities where there is no clear good guy or gal, there's very often clear evil, and their presence, again, boots on the ground, intimately involved in reporting and investigating on this situation, gives us, I believe, some of the clearest pictures, devoid of right-wing or left-wing or this narrative or that narrative, a real focus on the facts, the situation, and its impact on fundamental human rights. If you'll forgive me for a second, I'm going to read what stands in a sense from Human Rights Watch website as they're about, in a sense, a mission statement. Human Rights Watch investigates and reports on abuses happening in all corners of the world. Human Rights Watch are roughly 450 people of 70 plus nationalities who are country experts, lawyers, journalists, and others who work to protect the most at risk, from vulnerable minorities and civilians in wartime to refugees and children in need. Human Rights Watch directs their advocacy towards governments, arms groups, and businesses, pushing them to change or enforce their laws, policies, and practices. To ensure our independence, Human Rights Watch refuses government funding and carefully reviews all donations to ensure they are consistent with their policies, missions, and values. Human Rights Watch partners with organizations large and small across the globe to protect embattled activists and to help hold abusers to account and bring justice to victims. In that manner, we are proud tonight to introduce for the very first time Ari Sawyer. Ari joins us tonight. Ari is a U.S. border researcher at Human Rights. And tonight we're going to talk about Mexico. We're going to talk about the asylum issue. We're going to talk about something called migrant protection protocols. And of course, what some would argue as possibly the most destructive approach possible to a challenging asylum situation, the Remain in Mexico program, authored by the United States in a bipartisan manner that is astonishing, that a whole group of people could come together and form something so uniquely destructive together. So if there was a kumbaya moment recently in the United States in our divisive politics, there you have it. And as often happens, all that energy and smarts and effort was directed, well, at doing the wrong thing. Ari, thank you so much for joining us and listening to all that. We're proud to have you here with us tonight, and we appreciate the investment of time. Tell us, if we could start from the very beginning. Tonight we're going to set a little bit of a groundwork, and then we're going to talk about Mexico. And Mexico is going to continue to be a unique focus of the coalition because in so many ways, whether it's our drug policy, our economic policy, our immigration policy, our military policy, it is possibly one of the most complicated, most nuances, if you will, foreign policy issues that the United States faces anywhere on so many different levels. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you came to literally, and you hear us use this term all the time, boots on the ground, someone embedded deeply into Mexican culture and deeply into the border situation. And of course, give us a little flavor of Human Rights Watch and how they became to be an international force in human rights.
Hey, yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and looking forward to taking a deep dive into this issue. A little bit about me. So, as Pat said, I'm Ari Sawyer. I'm the U.S. border researcher with Human Rights Watch. I used to be a journalist. I studied journalism. I was a journalist for a while. I was doing net crime and part-time immigration, mostly like investigative work in Nashville, Tennessee. And then in California, and then I felt there was this sort of media landscape or it's just becoming very difficult, right, with the internet and the clickbait and all of that, and I wasn't really getting a lot of time to work on the things that I felt were really really critical and really important. For example, like I would be pulled off of an investigative piece, like go write about some viral video of a cow that got loose on campus somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and I was like, I need to be able to use my time. I need to make a better use of my time, and so I went to graduate school. I studied international policy and development with a focus on human trafficking, human security, and migration. And I've been with Human Rights Watch now for over 3 years. So yeah, I've worked all across the border, and I focus on U.S. border issues. Most of my work is about investigating human rights abuses committed by U.S. border officials. Sometimes that means investigating abuses committed by organized criminal operatives in Mexico and Mexican government officials. In these cases where the United States has subjected or sent a migrant or a U.S. asylum seeker to Mexico, so investigating those actors, but ultimately laying the blame sort of at the feet of the United States for their role in putting people in those situations in the first place. A little more about Human Rights Watch. I mean, that's pretty much what the rest of my colleagues are doing at Human Rights Watch. We're very focused on threats to democracy in the United States. We do a lot of, in the US program, we work on reparations issues. We work on police violence. We are generally abolitionists, and yeah, and just looking to try to make real, long-lasting change toward rights respecting policies in the United States. And sort of like what you said, I think a lot of people who are sort of pro rights respecting border policies were really excited to see the Biden administration come along, right? To see them win. The transition team was meeting with organizations, and some of my colleagues were getting excited, but I'm not gonna lie, it gives me no pleasure to say, that I like told them so. But at that time, I was like, Democrats have been historically awful on immigration policy as well, just like Republicans. It's like the one thing that they can get along on, more or less.
Well, I mean,
one of the things.
I was going to say the initial appointee for immigration by the Biden administration had a terrible record, and the entire immigration rights community got up and said, "What happened to campaign promises to engage aggressively?" Sorry, I have a tough voice tonight, but to engage aggressively in what we call border justice. So from the very beginning, I guess what I'd like to point out, it seems to me, as someone who's not a proponent of either major party, not a fan, that you go back, well, forever, but let's start in recent political history. The Obama administration were no heroes. Trump, okay, we'll just put that out there, Trump, but yet the Biden administration, I'm not here to focus on them tonight, but the Biden administration seems to be engaging in some of the same said policies as the Trump administration. Are there any heroes out there I'm missing?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of really problematic immigration policies in the United States going back to like the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? They're like, pretty much all of them are, founded in racism. Like if you go look back at like the congressional record on the matter, you can just see how deeply racist many of the U.S. border policies are. They are about keeping out certain kinds of people, certain undesirables, right? And yes, but I mean, I think it was like during the Clinton administration, like 1994 is when we saw this set of policies called prevention through deterrence. It's like the logic is that we're gonna like make it so painful and so difficult for people at the border that they will just like they or their friends or their families will just decide not to migrate anymore. And obviously, as we've seen over the over many decades, here that just doesn't work. Those policies don't work. They only hurt people and get people killed. And so I'm sad to say, no, there are no heroes. Yeah.
I mean, if I could, excuse me again. Wow. If I could clear up a couple of misnomers. Amongst cultural conservatives, you'll always hear people talk about, well, my grandparents did it the right way. They did it the legal way. But am I oversimplifying? Because I'd like to almost make this sort of an immigration 101 for a few minutes. Am I oversimplifying when I say, and my grandfather came to the United States from Ireland, when that American immigration policy largely consisted of you getting on a tramp steamer, coming to the United States, and literally, as long as your body parts weren't falling off and you had some sort of fake reference here to the United States, you were in, weren't you? Is that an oversimplification?
No, that's accurate. Yeah, I think something like 94% of folks who presented themselves at Ellis Island were allowed to enter the United States, and they did not have to ask for any permission before they left, right? Like they just showed up. There was no, there's no visa process, right? Like visas didn't exist back then. And then, I mean, even we even hear, Border Patrol is like more than 50% Latinx people. And so you'll hear Border Patrol try to say, we can't possibly be racist, right? Because like so many of us are Latino, but they're defending racist policies, right? And they will, so some of those agents will say like, oh, well, my parents came the right way. And it's like, you come to find out, it's just that there were like, there weren't prosecutions the same way. back then there were more work permits, like visas were granted more frequently, and or that person like came, overstayed their visa, and were able to take advantage of like the amnesty,
Right.
program in the 80s, right? So they
Mhm.
have, their green card, but like even if they did migrate irregularly.
Right. So this false canard that exists now, that somehow these folks represent some sort of evil, and that they got here the fair way. It just strikes me as there's a succeeding generation of Americans who want to be the last ones in.
Yeah.
They want to close the door behind them, and of course that's ridiculous. Our economy, our entrepreneurial economy, our academic economy, all rely on a steady infusion of folks from places other than the United States. And one of the reasons why we're suffering economic stagnation right now is the absence of two levels of workers, entry-level workers, as well as the challenges presented by the Trump administration to the academic community, and the way that they literally baited them and tortured them in their rather transient process back and forth as valued members of the academic community, which are the seeds, if you will, for some of the great entrepreneurial efforts we've had in this country. It's astonishing to watch. I wonder if you could also talk to us about the difference between asylum seekers and quote unquote, I'll use their term, illegal immigrants, because there is a substantial difference even within our twisted system of laws. And there was really an attempt by the Trump administration to cloud that and create this vision of them all being illegal. That's wildly incorrect, isn't it? Maybe you can give us a little background from your perspective.
Yeah. So, everyone, migrants also have rights. Like just
Right.
because they're crossing irregularly doesn't mean that they deserve to be shot or abused or, starved or otherwise mistreated, right? Of course not. But asylum seekers, they have special rights. They have special rights under U.S. and international law. So like,
Mhm.
and like one of them being the right to seek asylum. They have a right to, if they step on, one toe on U.S. soil, basically, like they have a right to seek asylum, and they have, and according to U.S. law, it doesn't matter where that happens. That person does not have to present themselves at a U.S. port of entry. They can simply cross between ports and flag down an immigration officer, which is what generally happens, right? Like they're flagging down Border Patrol and they're saying, hey, I'm afraid to return to my country. I'm here to seek asylum. And these are not people who are trying to take advantage of a system or sneak in or make themselves unknown to the U.S. government. They want to be out in the open. They want to do things. They often want to do things, sort of not like the right way, but in an open way, and have a legal status out of the shadows. Because when migrants have crossed irregularly and they're not able to participate in society in the same ways, right? Like they pay taxes but they don't get them back. They if a crime, if someone commits a crime against them, they can't really report it to their police for
Right.
fear of being deported. So there's all these risks involved, mainly for migrants, right?
Mhm.
If they've crossed irregularly. But United States, as we've seen under the Trump and Biden administration, have really gone a long way they've really shut down the U.S. asylum system and are every single day, performing sort of illegal expulsions or putting people into the program that we're going to speak about, in contravention with U.S. and international law.
Now, an important factor in this, if you will, that's parallel is the factors encouraging immigration and in particular asylum seekers. From your perspective, and I think one of the great misnomers is that folks are coming here to America to quote unquote soak the system. In reality, from your perspective, how many folks end up seeking asylum as a direct result of the United States war on drugs and various other ill-fated foreign policy decisions?
Oh, so many. I mean, it's of course, like there are it's complicated and there are
Right.
always, multiple actors, right? But the US has almost always had some hand in creating, if you look at like, okay, this person has fled, Mara Salvatrucha, right? Like threats of death in El Salvador. And that gang is a transnational criminal organization that is perfectly capable and often does, cross country lines to track folks down or, to go after them. And so they're trying to get out of range, right?
Hmm.
And why does Mara, what is the deal? What's the story of Mara Salvatrucha? Well, that was a gang that started in Los Angeles, and as the United States was like deporting young, like teenagers basically and young adults back to El Salvador, where the US has also created this like system or this like situation of insecurity and economic instability. They really managed to get a powerful hold on the country, on neighborhoods, and so it's just like in it's like double layered, like the US's involvement in like the situation in El Salvador. It goes back to the 70s, right? Like 60s and 70s, even like training death squads and arming fascists, and yeah, just pretty wild.
Right. And narco terrorism, because of America's insatiable appetite for drugs, which we've effectively,
Hmm.
one of the singular differences between, say, the Volstead Act in the 20s and the prohibition against alcohol is that alcohol production, illegal as it was, for largely stayed within the United States and some exposure to Canada. In the case of the war on drugs, we've outsourced that production largely to Latin and Central America, in part because of climate and in part because of growing seasons. But one of the things we like to say here is we have seen the enemy and he is us. And one point I like to bring up with folks with your background, do you find irony in the sense that in American culture, one of the most revered acts, and you'll see this throughout literature, throughout movies, television shows, and a Netflix coming to a living room near you, is the notion in drama that we celebrate the mother who will literally do anything for their child. And the mother who walks across nations, crosses borders, does all sorts of astonishing things, particularly if she's white, is revered in American culture. Yet that same mother, and I've met mothers like this personally, who have literally walked up from an oppressive regime in Brazil or the chaos in Venezuela and brought their children to the border, are pilloried because they are putting their children in that position. And I would argue, and I'd love your reaction to this, they didn't put their children in that position. We put their children in that position. Do you see the hypocrisy there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, it's not to let off the hook, the political or like the security forces, the government actors who are, there's no reason to torture, abuse, or target, political dissidents. There's no excuse for that. But yeah, the U.S. has absolutely 100% had a hand in creating a lot of the economic instability and the security risks and fascist states, right, that exist in Latin America, from the states from which people are fleeing. Um, I also think I think the Trump administration and I think the Department of Homeland Security have like long tried to paint these, like as you say, they've painted them out to be like irresponsible or something. But if you know that if you stay, it spells certain death, right? And you're like, okay,
Right.
if I stay here, the chances of my child dying are 100%.
Yep.
If I make it to the US border and seek asylum, the chances of my child dying are, I don't know, 50, 60%. The choice is clear. The choice is clear. And migrant mothers, I tell you, I've talked to a lot of them, and they are some of the most resilient, strong, brave, people that I've ever met in my life. Like, and they shouldn't have to be, right? Um, it's really too bad. And the United States makes their journey more dangerous. Um, has made has created a situation where this, like, the United States is responsible for how enormous the smuggling industry is. It's responsible for the sort of black market of kidnapping and extortion it's now systematic, right? It's like complete, like, it will be very hard to get rid of now, because we've got these criminal organizations who are just completely invested in snatching up the migrants that the United States sends to Mexico and extorting their family members, because actually like 92% of these folks have family in the United States, because of these sort of previous like rises in the number of people fleeing El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, right, back in the 80s and 90s.
Right. So now let's flash forward to the Trump administration. You've got an explosion in individuals seeking political asylum here in the United States. And to your point, there is a well-established process, both under American law and international law, to respect both the personal and civil rights of an asylum seeker, but also to afford them due process under the law in a very regulated structure in order to decide whether or not they were, quote unquote, worthy, for lack of a better term, of American asylum. And the borders were, to a large degree, overrun. The federal government in the United States was ill prepared to accept these folks. I happened to go down to Deming, and folks who've watched this show before are familiar with that situation. We visited a private, if you will, a privately funded, community-funded relief center. An armory was taking over in Deming, and it was, we interviewed the folks from up here in the show, and then we got money to go down to the border to meet people in person, and it was really an astonishing setup. They had taken this armory, they cleaned it up. It had showers, it had primary medical care, there were beds to sleep in, food to be had. Interestingly enough, it was one of the first organizations I met that used this sort of distributed model of Walmart and Amazon, where people, rather than send money and all the chaos that confuses, they would put up a daily wish list of things that they needed. And people would go on Amazon Prime, order the stuff, and it would just magically appear in 2 days. Shoelaces, I think you know why. Shoelaces being one of the primary needs, because folks may not be aware, but at the border, for men, they take their belts and their shoelaces. And a lot of these folks are, let's just say, I'm trying to be polite here, gaunt to begin with. It's a problem, and then they never get them back. It was so well run that the Border Patrol ended up just, rather than dropping these people off in the middle of a town, because the program at that point was to bring them to the nearest bus station to the border. Deming happened to be a significant transportation hub for that part of New Mexico, about 30 miles inland from the border, and they actually just ended up bringing people directly to the center. So we have the beginnings of at least a happier ending, right? And at that point in time, the Trump administration, happened to be the week that we went down, the Trump administration decided to interfere and create a couple of different programs, a lot of which relied on pinch points in nations prior to arriving at the doorstep of the United States, because for the Trump administration, this was a public relations nightmare, to say the least. It's already, given the vicious news cycles that exist here in this country, I think it's already been largely forgotten. And so you had these pinch points created, which effectively rounded up these people and often left them in the same jurisdictions that they'd fled, literally for fear of their life. And that brings us to tonight, to sort of a long and winding trail, if you will, but I think you've set important groundwork here. That brings us, if you will, to the question at hand, which is something called the MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols, and Remain in Mexico. So can you give us a little history of how that came about and the hellspawn situations that it's created in separation between parents and their children?
Yeah. So it has this like really Orwellian name. Should not be confused by that name. It is not protecting any migrants. On the contrary, it's put a lot of people at really serious risk, including like risk of death, right, murder, and kidnapping, and rape, and sort of all these things that we've documented that have resulted from the program. So what it is, we call it. So that's why we call it the Remain in Mexico program, right? That's like it's the colloquial name for the program. because, you know, it's hard. I think it was hard for like anyone really to just call it like the Migrant Protection Protocol. It's like so ridiculous. So we will call it like MPP for short, or Remain in Mexico. And what it is, so the Remain in Mexico policy is a bilateral U.S.-Mexico policy that that allows the United States, in particular Customs and Border Protection agents, to send non-Mexican asylum seekers to Mexican border cities, where they are compelled to wait for the duration of their U.S. immigration court proceedings, which can, you know, that can take years. Well, the Trump administration first implemented Remain in Mexico in 2019, and I think it started in El Paso. Yes. And it eventually spread across the border, right, to some different like this. There were some hubs, and we had some like new courts set up at the border. And so basically, what it looked like on the ground is that like these border agents would just send these, you know, mostly families, right, just across the bridge, the international bridge, in like whatever border town, with what's called a notice to appear. And this paper just tells them when they should show up in court, what time, you know, et cetera, like what they were being charged with. And it's like a charging document, sort of, but not officially, not legally. And so then they'd have this paper, and it would be in English, and it would say like, you have to present yourself at this port of entry at 4 a.m. on, you know, September the 5th or whatever. And so these people would like struggle to, you know, like find safe transportation that early in the morning. And they would have to show up to the U.S. port of entry, you know, get processed in by Customs and Border Protection, handed over to the custody of ICE. It was like a security company in most cases that ICE had contracted with, who then drive these people to a courthouse, right? On the U.S. side of the border, they go to court. They have their hearing. There are a series of hearings in the proceedings. After their hearing, they're generally kept, you know, overnight in Customs and Border Protection custody, in you know, like a really smart, like a temporary detention facilities, like really brutal, freezing cold, no blankets, you know, inadequate food, inadequate hygiene, yeah, just like pretty, our materials being provided to people was like pretty awful. And then, you know, they're sent back to Mexico once again the following day. So that's what it is. There's no real due process for asylum seekers under that program. It's extremely difficult to find a U.S. lawyer to represent them in court. You know, it's already tough for migrants to find an attorney, or asylum seekers to find an attorney when they're within the United States.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not given to them for free. It's not, they don't get appointed attorneys, even though they should. And so it's already, you know, they have to find one pro bono if they don't have money. Most folks don't have money. Most folks have spent like all the money that they have just to get to the border, right? And now being forced to remain in Mexico, it was even worse, right? It's like people were in hiding. They were being kidnapped. I've talked to so many people who've been kidnapped, you know, or
worse,
harmed in other ways.
Right.
Or worse. Yeah. I mean, best case scenario, like I talked to this one, there were fathers, like they had traveled together because they were like, okay, well, some safety numbers, right? We're both trying to seek asylum from the same neighborhood. Let's go. So it was his friend and their daughters, right? So like 2 adult men and their 2 daughters, like, you know, the kids were like 12, 13-year-old girls. They got kidnapped. And while like every time the girls would shower, these guys, like their kidnapped captors would just like watch them. Like they'd make them shower with the curtain open, and they would sort of like jeer at them and, you know, get close to them, but they didn't, but that's the best case scenario, right? Like they didn't actually sexually assault these girls. But like even that alone, like that experience alone, like traumatized those girls. You know, those girls are terrified. And now on top of all that, you know, they're being forced to, you know, wait in this, unhygienic and overcrowded makeshift refugee camp or makeshift, encampment, never in a refugee, there's not the services that you think about when you think of a refugee camp, like run by UNHCR. It wasn't that.
Right. Not
It
like on
was
TV.
awful. And and now after that experience, having to sleep in this tent in the open, just like, yeah. So that's what we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. We have effectively created, by our own very own self, by our own policies, a humanitarian crisis simply because of our own inability to get out of our own way bureaucratically. Wow. Again, winning hearts and minds around the world. You've taken so effectively, and the reason why I tend towards hyperbole a little bit. I'm one of those guys who just gets ramped up, but it strikes me that our circle of life in terms of American drug policy is to create a black market, an underground market, an unsafe market through our prohibition of recreational drugs, which then results in the production of those drugs illicitly in a foreign country, often under the most brutal circumstances imaginable, which then results in a trafficking nightmare over the border, which then creates violence amongst competing cartels or plazas, which then results in people fleeing those folks, often unimmunized, with terrible public health situations, those people coming to the country, which then creates its own public health crisis and a result, its own set of racial tensions, which then results in our reacting to it by putting these folks in refugee camps at our border, hidden from the eyes of American media, yet not unlike in certain cases that which you would see in the Middle East. Wow, congratulations. It's abominable. While simultaneously, we've got a serious labor shortage here in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, migrants shouldn't only be valued. I mean, we try to say this a lot, right? We're trying to explain to people why, there's this misconception that migrants steal jobs. You were talking about it earlier, right?
Right.
When not only do no one's stealing jobs from anyone. If there aren't, pitting the working class against one another, right, is like is what sort of like these bosses or like these bosses of the industry and capital are doing, because it's better for them. It keeps labor, it keeps labor cheap, right? It's like, oh, just blame the migrants for your low wages instead of saying like, oh, maybe I should pay a fair wage, right?
Right.
But in any case, migrants often, influxes of migrants create jobs. Like when you're moving to a small community, the more people that are there, the more people need services, the more people are paying an electric bill, the more people need, are eating food and buying things from their groceries. So it is sort of like, it doesn't make sense that they're like using, and it's not that, it's like they already also often have friends and families, communities there in the United States, or want to belong to the community in which they live, if it if it weren't for the racism and ostracization that they sometimes experience at the hands of sort of right wing, or not even right wing, because we've talked about like Democrats and Republicans that often agree on this issue, just don't really get it. But yeah, they're not like having said all that, I also think that migrants like the value of migrants is not only in their ability to grow the U.S. economy, right?
Right. Well, it was a real wake up for a bunch of us, though. We're here locally in Providence, Rhode Island, was clearly the coronavirus and the approach by the government to put freezes on rents and freezes on all sorts of issues surrounding home ownership as well as being a tenant, brought to light a really interesting fact. A significant number of real estate investors in the Rhode Island market with 5 or fewer units are actually first-generation immigrants who saw real estate ownership as a first step in economic progress for both their communities and their families. So there was a large meeting held for folks to get together and express mutual concerns. And I think a lot of folks assumed that everybody there would be white middle class with, or with, 5 or 6 buildings and strip malls, and it couldn't have been further from the case. We tend to think that immigrants come here and open up restaurants. Well, there's manufacturing, there's real estate investment. All of that is a net positive and an injection into activity into an economy, which, what's the cliche, raises all boats. Now, what are the Biden administration is elected in part based on their contention that they will clear up the border issues, that they will work towards border justice, as we call it. And one of the significant claims was that I believe they claimed they would end the Remain in Mexico program. What's the truth of that, and where do we stand right now?
Yes, so as you point out, they specifically promised to aim to end the Remain in Mexico program. They promised to implement humane border policies and create a rights-respecting border regime. They promised to respect the right of asylum and recognize the right of asylum, and to end all of these Trump-era policies. And they have been a major disappointment. They've broken all their promises. Not only, so they say that they. So let's start when Biden first got into office, their administration did soon officially end the Remain in Mexico program, and they began to parole people into the United States. There was this process for paroling people into the United States. People who had been subjected to Remain in Mexico under Trump. And to do that, the Biden administration was working with the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, to sort of try to advertise around and say, like, hey, if you were an asylum seeker impacted by this policy and you still have an active case, or if you have, or like some people with closed cases, then we will help you to, get into the United States, where they, would continue to pursue their asylum claim, but from the safety of their homes in the United States, right? And so that was happening, but that process also, like even the wind down process, was extremely slow going. They were not, and not everybody was eligible for it that should have been. So it was like limited in scope and extremely slow going. And then they got this order from the Fifth Circuit saying, this is a really bad order, but like the judges were just like willfully ignorant of U.S. Law and international law, right? They got this order that said that they needed to make a good faith effort to re-implement the Remain in Mexico policy. So the United States went back to work to look at how could they make a good faith effort to re-implement. And we argue at Human Rights Watch that, they could have taken a look. They could have made a good faith effort. And they could have said, there is no way that we can possibly guarantee the safety of any migrant sent by the United States to Mexico. We cannot guarantee that they'll have safe transportation. We cannot guarantee that they'll have access to basic services like water, food, shelter, and healthcare. And said, and therefore, and this program violates U.S. and international law, and so we can't do it. We made a good faith effort, and we can't. We should also mention here the collaboration of the Mexican president Andrés Manuel López Obrador, we call AMLO, and his willingness to just go along with this policy as well. Like AMLO could have stopped it, right? The U.S. court has no jurisdiction in Mexico. Could have stopped it, didn't. Has said the program was like pretty good, like pretty great. And so so there's just a collaboration between the U.S. and Mexico to abuse these folks.
And I just
And
want
so
to, and
not
what,
only, you
yep.
know, the court.
Mhm.
Mhm.
No, I just want to jump in and say, make this
Okay.
very clear. And again, please, I don't, I'm not an expert on this, but from my reading, and this is important, there's something called the 1967 Protocol, which is a reference to a UN convention which incorporates into law, and it's buttressed by something called the Refugee Act of 1980, that states are required to protect people living within their borders and prohibits them from sending people to other countries where they would be harmed based on their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. All of those make that individual a legal applicant for permanent asylum. So this is not some creation of some political group. This is the law, both international and our own federal law, that insists that we do this. This is not some measuring created, if you're a cultural conservative, by the Obama administration to subvert America. This is not some creation by some right-wing group to get people to work cheap at the maquiladoras, and I forgive my pronunciation, but none of this. This is established law with established case law that demands that we honor those situations. The irony is that many of the situations, as I've mentioned, that we are now required to honor by law are in fact situations that we've created through our own mess of foreign policies and drug policies. But this is not some invention, is it? This is, we ain't making this up as we go along, are we?
Yeah. I mean, and actually, U.S. national law. You know, Congress changed the law to incorporate, you know, that international law. Right. The U.S. is a signatory to the convention and has updated its own national laws so that it complies with the convention.
Right.
And basically, the Trump and Biden administrations are just like using some, like they like to talk about like loopholes and things like, you know, those are not real for people, for migrants. Like what they try to do is find loopholes, find legal loopholes, or at least, you know, some kind of argument where even if what they're doing is illegal, they're fighting it in court for so many years, you know. So it's like it's they can just make this and it'll take time to fight them in court on it. It would be better if they would just do the right thing, you know.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, what I was gonna say though is that court order that I mentioned that ordered them to make a good faith effort to re-implement that program, it did not order them to stop paroling in people who had previously been subjected to the program and who had closed cases, right? Like they're by definition no longer in the program, but there's this recognition by the Biden administration that anyone who was put and remain in Mexico, they were not given a fair shot to seek asylum. They were put in a really, you know, dangerous and impossible situation. There's something like 44% of all cases closed under the under the Remain in Mexico policy were removal orders in absentia, meaning the person didn't show up to their court hearing, often because they were kidnapped or they were in hiding at the time. You know, I've spoken to several people who were literally in captivity and afraid for their lives in Mexico. And yeah, like this convention says, right? Like people are afraid in Mexico, and they're afraid, you know, to return to their country of origin. So they're making them. The United States has essentially made them refugees of two countries.
Wow. Great point. We're a little bit of a tough connection right now. Let's talk about the children. We've got a few minutes left, so let's talk about the children and the status of the children who've been separated from their families.
Mm-hmm. So children, you know, children, there was this family separation policy under the Biden administration. I think more than 5,000 children were separated from their families, but that number actually doesn't include all of the, you know, the children separated from their families. And family separation happens in different contexts along the border. So, one of those being that I want to or what's the word? Well, acknowledge the it's like power of attorney that maybe an older brother's carrying. So one case I know are like one young man I spoke to. He had arrived at 19. They were shared with him a power of attorney, documentation saying that he was a legal guardian of these girls, and Border Patrol separated them, making the children unaccompanied. They got sent to shelter in the United States. They're going to have to go through, the
Oh,
alone. And what's that?
yeah, we broke up a little bit there. Maybe run that by us again.
Oh yeah. Let's see. So I was just saying family separation happens in these sort of different contexts, right? So it's happening when Border Patrol agents are separating children from like caregivers who are not their parents, from like, even though there might be a legal guardian. Or like another case I know of is like there was a grandma and she was a legal guardian of her 3 granddaughters, and they were like young, right? Like the youngest one I think was 5 or 6, and Border Patrol agents like literally ripped this child off, away from the grandmother, sent grandma to Mexico, sent her to Ciudad Juarez, one of the most dangerous cities in the in North America, and made those kids unaccompanied and put them in child detention in the United States. So another place where this is happening is as a result of the Remain in Mexico policy itself. So parents sometimes will feel compelled to make the very difficult decision of sending their children to present themselves at the border alone after they've been placed in the Remain in Mexico program, because they know that that's the only way that their children can access safety in the United States. So if they keep them, if they stay together, they're forced to live in this encampment. They're getting kidnapped. They're getting sexually assaulted, and all of these, like dangers and like lack of access to basic service or due process. And so, sometimes parents are like, what? I need to make sure my child is safe, and so they send them on alone into the United States. And then the other instance, the other cases where we're seeing family separation as part of the Remain in Mexico policy is when parents are going missing, like they're disappearing. They go to the store and never come back. Like presumably they're being killed or kidnapped or something. And kids just, I have no way of, they're gone. And so then some of those children have had the wherewithal to go and try and present themselves at a border and are now made accompanied as a result of this U.S. policy.
Wow. Well, I hope this situation isn't intractable. It seems like the solution at this point is to generate the resources necessary to both reunite as well these families, as well as provide expedited legal services, to process their asylum status and get them into the United States, where at least there'll be potentially the warm embrace of family and community members, and to normalize their positions so that they can work and go to school, and create something of a life for these, again, in exchange for nothing less than, and again, the complete destruction of their communities, where they came from, what they've had to endure, and just get beyond this. In closing, what do you think the odds are, given the current political climate, that we'll see any type of progress whatsoever?
Oh, I think it's really tough. I think the Biden administration has made enemies on all sides. I think that if they don't act now to just sort of take a principled stance at the border and just implement humane policies, then they're going to lose Democratic the midterms, and immigration policies only make worse these, these folks who are placed and remain in Mexico back to the U.S.
Oh, I hear you. We've lost your picture. I think the internet's been failing us a little bit in the last few minutes, but I want to thank you for coming on. I look forward to updates on process and progress in this situation, and whatever action that Human Rights Watch thinks that they can direct folks who are engaged here in the United States to work towards solving this, those suggestions would be helpful as well. Are you still with us?
Yep, I'm still here. It says the host stopped the video, so I think it was just, I don't think it's on my end actually. But
Yeah.
my internet has been spotty too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the rich discussion. And I will definitely keep you updated as there's any movement at all on these issues.
Ari Sawyer is we keep using the term boots on the ground. I hope you don't mind that.
I don't mind.
But a subject matter expert and the lead investigator for Human Rights Watch, an international organization that it just has an astonishing background in nations around the planet that are not typically, if you will, the bailiwick of the major American media, or what we call here lovingly the duopoly, for concern everything from Vietnam to Togo to Iran. They span the globe, and we're going to make sure that we put up and continue to publicize ways to donate to their efforts, support their efforts. And listen, let's stay in touch. Let's make this an ongoing conversation, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ari Sawyer, Human Rights Watch, dialing in from Mexico and joining us tonight to really bring an important context to what is an accelerating human rights debacle that's occurring both on the Mexican and the American side of our southwestern border. Again, thank you for joining us. Folks, that's going to bring us to a close tonight. This was the inaugural edition of the Pat Ford Hour, which is going to exist within the Coalition Radio Network. We're going to face head-on challenging issues that won't always be lighthearted and won't always have easy solutions, and certainly happy endings seem to avoid. But that's the point, isn't it? To engage in serious conversations about difficult issues with subject matter experts who are either embedded in or have primary experience firsthand. We're looking to end the notion that it's okay to think that journalism constitutes people's reporting on other people's reporting, which is analysis of someone else's analysis. That's got to stop. We are the Coalition. This was the Pat Ford Hour. We will continue, as always, to be outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the Mighty Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Give us a follow, give us a like. Our link tree is everywhere, so you can find out where YouTube replays of this going to be. We're going to put this into replay. Joining us immediately after this, or within a few minutes, will be a recording of the Irina Zuckerman Washington Outlook. Stay tuned for that, and thanks for joining us tonight.